The room you're lying in right now is dark, or close to it. Maybe there's a faint line of light under the door, or the distant hum of something electrical, or the particular quality of silence that only comes at this hour. That thick, muffled quiet that belongs entirely to the night. You're still, your breath is slow, or getting there. And somewhere in the soft drift between waking and sleep, here is a question worth sitting with. What if one of the most powerful men who ever lived, a man who commanded legions, rewrote law, transformed an empire, had his face deliberately chiseled off statues, had his name quietly removed from official records, had the very mention of his origins treated like an inconvenient rumor that history would eventually forget? What if it mostly worked? Close your eyes for a second. Imagine being that man. Imagine Staunton at the summit of the Roman world, the most powerful political entity on earth, an empire stretching from the deserts of North Africa to the cold fog of northern Britain, and knowing that even as your voice echoed through marble chambers, even as senators bowed their heads in your presence, even as the machinery of an entire civilization bent itself to your will, there were people in that same room quietly deciding that you didn't quite fit the story they wanted to tell, that the story of Rome had a certain shape, a certain complexion, a certain face, and yours wasn't it. His name was Septimius Severus. He was born in what is now Libya. He grew up speaking Punic, the language of Carthage, the ancient tongue of North Africa, before he ever learned a word of Latin. His sister, when she came to visit him in Rome after he'd become emperor, spoke so little Latin that he reportedly sent her back home, embarrassed by how clearly African she sounded. Think about that for a second. The emperor of Rome was embarrassed by how African his own family sounded. Not because he was ashamed of being African, but because Rome, which had been built in part by African labor, African grain, African gold, African soldiers, couldn't quite reconcile the fact that the man at its center had come from that place. There is a portrait of Septimius Severus that survived, a painted wooden roundel found in Egypt, dating to around 200 CE. In it you can see him clearly. His face is dark, his hair is tightly coiled, he is wearing the imperial purple and a golden crown, and he looks directly out at whoever is looking at him with an expression of complete, unhurried authority. He looks like a man who knows exactly who he is, and for most of the last 2,000 years, history looked away. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment and just acknowledge something. You're here and it's late or early, or somewhere in that liminal stretch of hours that belongs to neither. A lot of people come to Hidden Past Revealed exactly for this. To let their mind travel somewhere quiet and enormous, somewhere that makes the world feel vast and interesting rather than small and loud, until they slowly drift away. That's exactly what this channel is for. And if it helps you get there, if spending this hour with the stories history tried to bury is the thing that quiets your mind, then I'm genuinely glad you're here. If you haven't already subscribed to Hidden Past Revealed, it takes 2 seconds and it means the next time you need exactly this. A dark room, a quiet voice. A story worth losing yourself in. There'll be something new waiting. That genuinely means more than you know. Drop a comment wherever you are. The city, the hour, what's on your mind. I read every single one, and I'm always a little moved by how many corners of the world this reaches in the dark. Now, here is what most people think they know about ancient Rome. They picture it white, gleaming marble, pale statues of pale men in flowing togas making grand speeches about virtue and law and the eternal glory of the Republic. They picture the senators as descendants of Italian farmers, the generals as men from the hills of Latium, the emperors as beings of almost mythological Romanness, connected by blood and language and culture to the city's founding legends. This is not an accident. This image was constructed. It was built deliberately stone by stone and story by story over centuries. partly by Roman writers themselves who were doing their own version of national myth-making, and partly by later European historians who saw in Rome a convenient ancestor, a classical mirror, in which to admire a reflection that looked reassuringly familiar. But here is what the archaeology actually shows. Here is what the coins and the inscriptions and the DNA studies and the papyri and the military records and the trade ledgers all say when you read them carefully. Rome was, from the very beginning, one of the most ethnically complex civilizations in the ancient world. The city itself was fed by North Africa. Roughly a third of Rome's grain supply came from Egypt and the provinces of North Africa, and with that grain came people. Merchants, soldiers, administrators, scholars, enslaved workers who eventually gained their freedom and became citizens. The Roman legions were recruited across an empire that stretched from Scotland to Syria, from the Rhine to the Sahara. By the 2nd and 3rd century CE, it was not uncommon for a Roman general to have been born in what is now Spain, or Tunisia, or modern-day Turkey, or the Levant. The emperors themselves reflected this. Trajan and Hadrian were from Spain. Elagabalus was Syrian. Philip the Arab, another emperor whose African and Middle Eastern origins have been quietly minimized, was from the Hauran region in what is now southern Syria. The dynasty that Septimius Severus founded, the Severan dynasty, included emperors from Libya and Syria. Rome's power was never really about ethnicity. It was about citizenship, about loyalty to the empire, about speaking Latin well enough to navigate the bureaucracy. The common misconception is that Septimius Severus was an anomaly, a curiosity, an interesting footnote in the long story of Rome's more properly European rulers. He wasn't an anomaly. He was the rule wearing its plainest face. He was what Rome had always been, complex, syncretic, built from everywhere, finally sitting on the throne and refusing to look apologetic about it. The erasure came later. It always does. Septimius Severus was born on the 11th of April 145 CE in a city called Lectis Magna. If you've never heard of Lectis Magna, picture this: a coastal city on the Gulf of Sidra in what is now northwestern Libya. Not a provincial backwater, not a frontier outpost. One of the most prosperous, architecturally spectacular cities in the entire Roman world. A place of broad colonnaded streets and marble forums and a harbour so perfectly engineered that its ruins still stand today 2,000 years later. So well preserved that archaeologists have called it the Pompeii of North Africa. The city smelled of salt and heat and something sweet underneath, the specific warm dry dust scent of North African stone that has spent all day drinking in the sun and is now slowly releasing it back into the night air. The streets were wide enough for 2 carts to pass side by side. The public baths were as grand as anything in Rome itself. The theatre could seat 15,000 people. Septimius Severus grew up in this city. He grew up speaking Punic, the language descended from the Phoenicians, the tongue of Carthage, a language ancient and rich and utterly non-Latin. He also spoke Greek, which was the educated Mediterranean's second language, the way English is now, and he learned Latin. But it never quite lost its North African edge. Writers of the time noted that he retained what they called a slight accent his whole life, even after decades in Rome, even after becoming emperor. His family was wealthy, not aristocratic Roman wealthy, but provincially comfortable. The kind of family that could afford to send their son to Rome for a proper education, which they did. He arrived in Rome probably in his early 20s. He studied, he made connections. He entered the cursus honorum, the course of honours, the Roman political career ladder that began with minor administrative positions and, for the ambitious and fortunate, eventually led somewhere considerable. He was ambitious, conspicuously, almost relentlessly ambitious. The Roman writer Cassius Dio, who knew Severus personally and left one of the most detailed accounts of his reign, described him as a man of enormous energy who barely slept, who was on horseback at dawn and dictating letters past midnight, who seemed to genuinely believe that rest was something other people did. He was not particularly warm. He wasn't charming in the way that made people love him instinctively. He was precise, systematic, and absolutely certain of his own abilities in a way that either inspired total loyalty or deep resentment, with not much territory in between. He married twice. His first wife died young. His second wife, Julia Domna, was Syrian from the city of Emesa in what is now central Syria, the daughter of a high priest of the sun god Elagabal. She was by all accounts one of the most remarkable women in Roman history, a philosopher, a patron of the arts and sciences, a political partner to her husband in ways that Roman culture officially didn't permit but practically couldn't prevent because she was simply too capable to exclude. Their marriage was apparently genuine, not just a political arrangement, but a real partnership between two people who were both, in their own ways, outsiders to the Roman establishment. Think about what that image means. The Emperor of Rome and his Empress, one from Libya and one from Syria, sitting in the center of a civilization that had convinced itself it was a European project. Severus rose through the military. He commanded legions in Syria, in Gaul, in Pannonia, in what is now Hungary. He was a skilled general, methodical rather than dazzling, the kind of commander who won not through brilliance but through preparation and refusal to make the same mistake twice. By 193 CE, he was commanding the legions of the Danube frontier, and then Rome collapsed. Not the physical city, the imperial order. In 192 CE, the Emperor Commodus was assassinated. What followed was one of those moments of pure political chaos that Rome periodically generated, multiple men claiming the throne simultaneously, each backed by different legions, the whole empire suddenly balanced on the edge of civil war. The year 193 CE is known to historians as the Year of the Five Emperors. 5 men claimed the purple within a single year. Pertinax was killed after 86 days. Didius Julianus famously bought the throne at auction from the Praetorian Guard, literally bid for it like a man buying a horse, and lasted 66 days before being executed. Septimius Severus had been watching. He had been planning. He moved his legions toward Rome with a speed that left his rivals scrambling, arrived at the city before they could consolidate, and was declared emperor by the Senate in June of 193 CE. He was 47 years old. He had just engineered the capture of the most powerful political office in the known world, and he walked into the Senate wearing military armor, not a toga, a deliberate choice, a statement. He wasn't pretending to be a civilian statesman. He was a soldier. He had won this by force, and he intended everyone to know it. He would rule for 18 years. Here is where it gets strange. Here is where the story stops being simply about one remarkable man and starts being about something deeper, about what Rome was, what it had forgotten it was, and what Septimius Severus forced it to remember. When he arrived in Rome and took power, Severus did something that every previous emperor had done, and yet somehow, in his case, felt like a revelation. He brought his family. His sister Octavia came from Lectis Magna, and according to the historical sources, including the biographical collection known as the Historia Augusta, which is frustrating and unreliable but still rich with specific details, her Latin was poor enough to cause embarrassment, specifically the kind of embarrassment that a man in Severus's position could not easily absorb. He reportedly sent her back to Africa. Sit with that for a moment. The Emperor of Rome sent his own sister home because she sounded too African. This is not a story about Severus being ashamed of his origins. The evidence suggests the opposite. That he publicly celebrates his connections to North Africa, that he poured extraordinary resources into rebuilding and beautifying Lectis Magna, elevating it to one of the most architecturally spectacular cities in the empire. The triumphal arch he built in the Roman Forum celebrating his military victories still stands today. The portraits of his family, the coins minted with his face, the official imagery of his reign. None of it hides where he came from. The story about his sister is a story about the gap between what power officially claims and what it privately demands. It is a story about the way a man can be at the summit of a civilization and still feel the weight of its expectations pressing against who he is. The Roman aristocracy did not love him, they tolerated him because they had to. The Senate in particular had a complicated relationship with Severus. He needed them for the appearance of legitimacy, and they needed him for their physical survival, and both parties were clear-eyed enough about this arrangement to be mutually, cordially hostile. He executed several senators early in his reign, men who had supported his rivals. He made it unmistakable that the Senate's ceremonial authority was exactly that, ceremonial. But here is what the evidence actually shows about how Rome responded to Severus over time. He was, by most measurable standards, effective. The empire's finances were reformed. The military was modernized. He raised legionary pay for the first time in over a century, improved conditions for soldiers' families, allowed soldiers to legally marry while in service, previously prohibited. He conducted successful military campaigns in the east against the Parthian Empire, taking the city of Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, in what is now Iraq, and expanding Rome's eastern frontier. He campaigned in Scotland, reaching further north than any Roman army before or since, building or restoring a chain of forts across what would become the Scottish lowlands. He died in York in February of 211 CE, at the age of 65. He had been ill for some time, possibly gout, possibly something more systemic. It was winter in northern Britain, which meant grey skies and cold that pressed through stone walls like something personal. He had been in Britain for nearly 3 years, conducting his Scottish campaign, and by all accounts knew he was dying. His reported last words, according to Cassius Dio, were directed at his sons who would succeed him. Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, scorn everyone else. It is possibly the most honest imperial succession advice in Roman history. It is also deeply sad, a dying father telling his sons that in the end the only things that matter in this life are family, the people who do the actual work, and not caring too much about what everyone else thinks. His sons were not harmonious. One murdered the other within a year. But that is another story, the philosophical dimension of Septimius Severus. And there is one, buried under all the military campaigns and political maneuvering, has to do with something that is almost impossible to see from inside your own time. Every civilization tells itself a story about what it is. Rome's story was particularly seductive and particularly durable. The story of a city born from greatness, shaped by divine will, governed by reason and law, destined to bring civilization to the uncivilized world. It was a story about European hills and Italian soil and the particular wisdom of men who spoke Latin correctly. Septimius Severus, simply by existing at the top of that structure, by being undeniably, visibly, audibly from somewhere else, complicated that story in ways that Rome's institutions never quite resolved. Consider this, he was a devoted believer in dreams and astrology. This is not a minor biographical footnote. Cassius Dio records that Severus consulted astrologers constantly, that he had his own birth chart drawn up and publicly displayed as part of his claim to imperial destiny, that he reportedly chose Julia Domna as his second wife partly because her horoscope indicated she was destined to marry a king. He also had a deep religious life that was pointedly not purely Roman. He worshipped the North African solar deity and maintained connections to the religious world he had grown up in. His son Caracalla, after his death, would erect enormous temples to Egyptian deities in Rome itself. The religious world of the Severan dynasty was syncretic in the way that only people who genuinely carry multiple identities can be, not performing diversity, but actually living inside it. And here is the question nobody asks enough. What did Severus himself understand about what he represented? Because there is evidence, subtle, indirect, but persistent, that he knew. that he was not naive about the symbolic weight of his position. The way he rebuilt Electis Magna wasn't just civic pride. It was a statement. He transformed his hometown into one of the jewels of the empire, gave it a new forum, new temples, a spectacular colonnaded street, a harbour complex that was the envy of the Mediterranean. He was saying something with those buildings. He was saying, this place, this North African city, this Punic-speaking cosmopolitan port town, belongs at the centre of the Roman story. He was rewriting the architecture of what Rome meant, and for a moment, for the 18 years of his reign and the 20-odd years of the dynasty he founded, it worked. The Severan dynasty included his wife Julia Domna, their sons Caracalla and Geta, and then a succession of emperors from Julia Domna's Syrian family, who ruled through the 220s and into the 230s CE. For nearly half a century, the Roman Empire was governed by people from North Africa and the Levant. This is not a footnote. This is not an asterisk in a longer, purer European story. This is the Roman Empire at the height of its late power, governed by Africans and Syrians, funded by North African grain, defended by legions recruited from across the known world. And then the political wheel turned, as it always does, and other dynasties came, and the story that Rome told about itself gradually shifted, and the faces in the portraits began to look different again, and the particular contribution of Septimius Severus and Julia Domna and the Severan dynasty began to be minimized, contextualized, explained away. By the time European Renaissance scholars were poring over Roman texts and reconstructing the classical world as the intellectual foundation of modern Western civilization, the Septimius Severus problem had been more or less solved by simply not mentioning it very often. The painted roundel, that remarkable Egyptian portrait showing a dark-skinned emperor in imperial purple, survived not because anyone preserved it, but because Egypt's dry climate preserved almost everything. It sat unrecognized for centuries. When it was finally identified and studied in the modern era, some scholars found reasons to question its accuracy, to suggest the pigment might have faded unevenly, to propose interpretations that would make the face look lighter. The evidence did not cooperate with these interpretations. The face in that portrait looks the way it looks. Here is what Septimius Severus reveals about you. Not you specifically, though in some ways, yes, you too, but the broader you, the species. The way human beings have always had an uneasy relationship with the stories we tell about ourselves, and the complicated reality that keeps undercutting them. We need our origin stories to be clean. This is not a moral failing, it is a cognitive one, and probably an evolutionary one. The human mind organizes experience into narratives, and narratives have a particular hunger for consistency. They want the past to explain the present in a way that feels inevitable. They want the heroes to look like the people who are telling the story. This is why every civilization, in every era, has done some version of what Rome's later interpreters did with Septimius Severus, not necessarily through malice. The malice played its role, but through the quieter, more pervasive mechanism of emphasis and omission. What you mention, what you don't mention, what you put in the textbooks and what you leave in the footnotes. The remarkable thing about Septimius Severus is not that he was erased. Erasure is, historically, extremely common. The remarkable thing is that he wasn't erased completely. The coins survived, the statues survived, even the ones that had their faces chiseled down. The chiseling itself is evidence. The portrait survived in Egyptian sand. The Historia Augusta, unreliable as it is, preserved enough specific detail to reconstruct the man. Cassius Dio, who lived through the reign and wrote about it, is still accessible to us. The record was damaged, it was not destroyed, and this tells you something about the durability of truth, or at least of evidence. That, even when the powerful decide a story is inconvenient, the residue remains. The coins with the right face, the portrait in the sand, the sister who sounded too African, The last words in a cold room in northern Britain. History is never as clean as the people who write it would prefer. There are always edges, always the places where the story frays slightly, and you can see through to something more complicated and more true underneath. The fact that you are lying in the dark right now thinking about a North African man who was Emperor of Rome 2,000 years ago, whose story was minimized and contextualized and quietly set aside. That fact is itself a kind of small reclamation, not a grand one, not a complete one, but something. The Stoic philosophers that Septimius Severus was certainly familiar with, Marcus Aurelius, whose death preceded his own reign, left behind the Meditations, arguably the most intimate philosophical document to survive from ancient Rome. Those philosophers had a concept for what we might call the long view. The idea that any individual moment, any individual life, is part of a current so vast and continuous that the question of whether you personally are remembered almost becomes irrelevant. Severus might have appreciated that, might have found something steadying in it. He had been to Scotland, to the northernmost edge of the known world, and looked out at the grey water beyond the last Roman fort. He had seen from the pinnacle of earthly power how enormous the earth was, how old, how indifferent. He understood, perhaps, that he was not the story. He was just a man in the story, like everyone else. Let your breath slow now. Let the thoughts soften. The room is still dark. Your body is still here, heavy and warm against whatever surface is holding you. 2,000 years ago, in a city on the North African coast, a boy grew up speaking Punic. He learned the smell of Mediterranean salt and the particular quality of North African light, the way it bleaches stone and makes everything look ancient, even things that are new. He learned the words for power in 3 languages. He carried all of it with him, across the sea to Rome, up the long ladder of an empire's ambitions, all the way to the top. He stood in the Roman Forum and he built his triumphal arch, and somewhere in his chest he must have carried the sound of Lectis Magna. The harbour, the crowds, his mother's voice, the language that Rome would never quite understand. He died in Britain, in February, in the cold, 3,000 miles from where he was born, and somewhere in between those 2 points, the warm coastal city and the grey northern frontier. He lived one of the most complete and improbable lives in human history. The stars over Lectis Magna are the same stars over the place where you are lying right now. They don't care about the stories we tell. They don't know about erasure or emphasis or the footnotes of history. They just burn and burn, as they have burned since before there was anyone to look at them. Your ancestors lay under those stars too, however long ago, in whatever language, in whatever darkness. They looked up at the same vast sky and they wondered about the same things we wonder about now. Where did we come from? Who were we? Does it matter that they remember us? Let those questions be soft now. Let them drift. You don't need to answer them tonight. Thank you for spending this time with Hidden Past Revealed. Genuinely, these are the hours I'm most grateful for. The quiet ones, when the world is still and the stories that got buried have a chance to surface. If this helped you drift off, or if you learned something you didn't expect to like, means more than you might think. It helps this channel reach people who are lying in their own dark rooms, wondering about the same things. And a comment with your location and the time. I love those. I keep a kind of mental map of where these nights are happening. All the cities and small towns and late-night kitchens and insomnia-lit bedrooms where people are listening. Tell me where you are. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. It takes 2 seconds and it means you'll never miss a night like this one. And if you ever want to support the work quietly, channel membership is there. No pressure, no obligation, just a way to keep these stories being told. Sleep well. Humans have been doing this since the beginning. Lying down under the sky, telling each other the true stories, the ones that were almost lost. You're part of that now. The dark is old and kind, and it has been waiting for you. Let it hold you.